A poor farmer followed his dog into the fields. What he found changed his life forever. A poor farmer bent down to water his crops, but what he saw buried beneath the soil left him speechless. The wind had died hours ago, yet the wheat stubble rippled as if something were breathing underneath. Elias, thin, sunburned, sleeves patched and repatched, stood still, listening to a field that should have been silent. His dog Ash paced in tight circles, nose pressed to the ground, whimpering like a child who knows a secret and fears to speak it. The sun slid behind the low hills, and the first cool of evening touched the cracked earth, carrying a scent that didn't belong to drought, iron, old wood, and the faint, impossible hint of rain. "Easy," Elias whispered. He didn't have many words left by the end of a day. The land had taken them alongside his strength, but Ash's ears twitched and the dog pulled toward the far edge of the field, toward the broken fence post that leaned like a drunk too stubborn to fall. Elias followed, boots lifting small ghosts of dust. Every footstep was a memory of better seasons, the rhythm of harvest, the chorus of neighbors calling across the furrows, the laughter of his wife when flour dusted her hair like winter. Memory is a cruel water when there is none to drink. Ash stopped, set a paw on the ground, and let out a low, warning growl. Elias knelt. The soil here was darker, as if the earth had bled. He pressed his palm against it. Something hummed beneath his hand, a vibration so soft he wondered if it came from his own tired bones. He pressed harder. There, a soft music, like the resonance of a bell that had been struck miles away. He looked up. The sky had gone from copper to bruised purple. Night was coming, and with it the usual calculation. Do you stay to finish what you've started, or do you leave it for a tomorrow that might not arrive? The hum rose again, faint but insistent, and Ash pawed at the spot until his nails scraped wood. Elias pulled the dog back. He scooped with his hands, then with the rusted trowel he always kept in his belt. The top layer gave easily, flaking like old paint. Beneath it, his fingers found edges, straight lines where the earth prefers curves. Wood, yes, but not the rotten, pulpy kind that dissolves when you touch it. This felt sealed, stubborn, preserved by the dry years that had punished everything else. He cleared a square the size of a dinner plate and sat back, breath coming fast. The hum had grown clearer, not loud, not hostile, just there like a heartbeat through a wall. He swallowed. The last time he'd felt something this strange, he'd been a boy hiding under a table while men argued about the fate of land that didn't have a voice. His father had told him that the soil remembers. He hadn't understood then. He did now. "Show me," he said to the ground, to the past, to whatever had waited for him all these years. Another breath, another scrape. The trowel struck metal, a band of iron half an inch thick, cool as shade. He traced it with his fingertips until he found a notch. A latch? A hinge? He dug to the right, then to the left, working by feel, by instinct, by a kind of faith that rises only when a man has nothing else to climb. Ash lay down beside him, head on paws, eyes never leaving the growing hole. The dog's chest rose and fell faster than usual. He was listening too. From the ridge beyond the fence, a truck engine coughed, the rich landowner's men heading home, leaving behind their fields of green, their sprinklers spitting diamonds into the dusk. Elias thought of the bank envelope on his kitchen table, pale as a threat. He thought of Mara's quiet hands kneading yesterday's dough into today's bread, making hunger wait one more evening. He thought of the neighbors who had already left, their houses like broken teeth in the jaw of a dying street. The trowel slipped. His knuckles cracked against iron and he hissed through his teeth. He wiped the blood on his trousers and kept digging. Men like him don't stop because of blood. They stop when the sun refuses to rise. At last his fingers found a ring set into the iron. It was small, dull and smooth with age. He tugged. Nothing moved. He dug deeper around it, cleared the corners, pried, levered, begged in a whisper. The ring lifted a fraction. The hum rose like a voice leaning in to be heard. Elias braced his heels against the earth, grabbed with both hands, and pulled. The ground exhaled. Dust slithered into the gap as a square of wood came free. No, not wood. A lid, iron-banded, pitch-sealed, time-proofed. Cold air spilled up from the darkness below. Elias coughed and leaned back, eyes watering. Ash licked his wrist and let out a sound halfway between a bark and a sob. From inside the hole, the hum drifted up again. Clearer now, a throat finally unblocked. Elias peered into the opening. The last orange of daylight slid a thin blade down the hole and caught on something that shouldn't have been there. something smooth and pale, wrapped in oilskin, stamped with a symbol he'd never seen, a star cradling a seed. The field had been empty for years, but it had been keeping a secret. He reached down, and that was when everything began. Elias had never called himself a farmer out loud. It felt too big a word for a man who spent his days pleading with the sky and bargaining with stones. He owned 5 worn acres at the edge of a town that maps forgot, a place where the railroad had once promised a future, and then slipped away like a guest who leaves in the night with the silver. His house was 3 rooms of stubborn wood, and a roof that leaked only when the weather remembered how. 2 chairs at the table, 2 cups. His wife Mara kept them clean, and that was how dignity made its home when money wouldn't. Drought had come quiet at first. Shorter rains, thinner creeks, the well rope growing longer each month as if it were stretching toward a vanishing promise. Then the heat had settled in like a landlord with too many keys. Good men sold their tractors for scrap. Good women sold their wedding rings to pay for seed that would never sprout. Children learned silence younger than they learned secrets. The church bell rang softer, as if it were saving its strength for a funeral no one could afford. Elias worked mornings by the calendar and afternoons by hope. He rose before the light learned the names of things and walked the rows with Ash at his heels. He checked the cracked hoses he'd patched with 100 concessions. He tapped the barrels that caught the rare rain and prayed they'd sound fuller than they were. He spread his palms against stalks that refused to rise and tried not to think of the letter on the table, the bank's demand written in polite words, sharp enough to cut a man's sleep into ribbons. 45 days. 45 days to make right what years of weather had made wrong. Neighbors had left in trucks with beds piled high, the holy junk of a life strapped down with rope and hope. They waved as if distance were a small thing. It wasn't. Distance separates a man from the land the way skin separates a body from its blood. Remove it, and nothing works the same again. Only a few families remained. Widow Ruth in the next plot over, whose laughter, when it came, sounded like wind chimes in an empty room. The Morales boys who fixed everything with parts that didn't match but somehow obeyed. And beyond the ridge, the fields of Mr. Harrow, the rich landowner who had water rights older than anyone's memory and a smile that never reached his eyes. His rows were green even when clouds refused to be. His sprinklers spun like indifferent ballerinas. He owned a dog too, some white show thing that wore a collar with a nameplate thicker than Elias's wallet. Ash was no show dog. Found as a pup near the riverbed the year it last remembered water, he'd walked into the farmhouse like someone returning to a place he'd been asked to guard. He didn't bark needlessly. He didn't chase his tail. He guided. When Elias lost a spade in the field, Ash found it. When a hen escaped the makeshift coop, Ash brought it home without a feather out of place. And when Mara cried quietly after she thought Elias had fallen asleep, Ash put his head on her lap and stared at him with eyes that said plainly, "We are 3. And we will stay that way." On the day the fields breathed, Mara had sent Elias back outside after supper with a wedge of bread wrapped in a cloth. "Eat when you remember," she'd said with a half smile that apologized for the size of the wedge. "Come in before it gets cold." By cold she meant night. Night made the house larger than the people inside it. Night made fear speak in voices that sounded like tomorrow. He'd meant to check the clamps on the western hose and then come back. But Ash had not headed west. The dog had trotted straight for the leaning fence post and stopped, ears forward, as if listening for footsteps underground. Elias had followed because he always followed when Ash decided. Pride is a luxury. Trust is cheaper and more valuable. He had not expected the hum. He had not expected the iron ring. He had not expected to find his hands shaking like a boy's when he finally lifted the sealed lid and cold air touched his face like the hand of a long-dead friend. He sat at the edge of the opening and tried to steady his breath. The hole was about the size of a crate, deeper than his arm could reach. The oilskin-wrapped bundle sat tilted on a shelf of stone, not quite at the bottom, as if someone had set it down carefully and then sealed the world above it in a hurry. The symbol, the star holding a seed, glowed faintly where the knife of sunset found it. He had the strangest feeling that he was being watched, not by eyes, but by years. Ash nudged his shoulder. Elias tied the rope from his belt around his wrist, a habit from a younger time when he'd learned the hard way that a man who reaches into darkness should give someone the right to pull him back. He lowered his arm into the hole. The air was cool and smelled of cedar and paper, of iron, of a storm that might decide to forgive. His fingers brushed the bundle. It was heavier than it looked. He gripped the edge of the oilskin and dragged it toward him, inch by stubborn inch, while dust ticked into his hair and into the corners of his eyes. When he finally pulled it free and set it on the dirt, his hands were numb. He sat there, staring at it, while the last thread of daylight broke and the first stars arrived like witnesses. What was this? Treasure? A prank by boys who had grown old before he did? A trap? He worked the knots with the tenderness of someone unwrapping a child's gift. The oilskin peeled back, dry and waxy, and revealed a cedar box bound with iron straps. A keyhole sat in the middle, stubborn and blind. Elias laughed once, low and bitter. Of course it would be locked. Of course the world would hide its mercy behind one more thing he did not have. He almost wrapped it back up, almost slid it into the hole and replaced the lid and walked away, whistling a lie to himself about how none of this had happened. But Ash whined softly and placed a paw on the box as if to say, "Not tonight. Not after all these hungry seasons. Not after you have come this far." Elias ran his thumb over the keyhole. Something about it felt familiar, though he couldn't say why. He stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and looked toward the farmhouse. In the kitchen drawer lay a little tin of nails, screws, and the odd bits of metal he kept the way men keep wishes, just in case. He pictured Mara by the stove, stirring a pot that needed more and inventing flavor from patience. He pictured the bank envelope lying where the light could find it, because nothing is less threatening in full view. He strapped the box to his back with his belt, lifted the iron-banded lid, and slid it back into place to keep the hole safe. He would return tomorrow to fill it in, or to open it again. He didn't know which. For now, he whistled to Ash. Together they walked home through rows that remembered rain. Behind them, the field hummed once more, a soft note of approval, like the land itself had spoken Elias's name. They set the cedar box on the kitchen table, as if it were a guest too important to keep waiting on the porch. Mara lit the small oil lamp, and its thin flame lifted the room from gray to amber. The bank envelope looked suddenly trivial beside the iron-banded wood, like a bully caught without his friends. Ash lay down with his chin on his paws, eyes never leaving the box. "It hummed," Elias said, still half surprised to hear the claim in his own voice. Mara's brows rose. "The land talks when it's tired," she said, repeating a saying her grandmother had passed down. "Sometimes we finally listen." He tried 3 nails, a bent screw, and a file ground to a point. Nothing fit the keyhole. The lock was old but not weak. It had the quiet authority of a door that knows what it's hiding. Elias stood, went to the drawer no visitor ever opened, and brought out a little ring of oddments. A watch key from a pawned pocket watch, a brass tag stamped with a number that didn't match any he could remember, and a small iron key with a star nicked into its bow. He paused. "Where did that come from?" Mara turned the iron key in her palm. "Your father found it under the floorboards after the war. He said it didn't belong to any door he owned. He kept it because some things feel like instructions even when they're quiet." Elias tried the star-marked key. It resisted, then surrendered with a sigh so soft he would have missed it, if not for the stillness that followed. He lifted the lid. A cool breath slipped out and touched their faces. Inside, cedar slats framed careful compartments lined with oiled cloth. No gold, no jewels, no burden of riches heavy enough to break a man. Instead, a journal tied with twine, a packet of paper envelopes sealed with wax, a folded map brittle at the creases, and a small round token of brass stamped with the same emblem from the oilskin, a 5-pointed star cradling a seed. Elias and Mara looked at each other the way people do when fear and hope collide and recognize each other. Mara untied the journal and turned the first page. "Ansel Ward," she read, "and the Star and Seed Cooperative. Spring, 1932. The handwriting marched like a man who had somewhere to be. Ansel wrote about the days when the wind stole the soil, when families slept with damp cloths over their faces, when a man could lose a field overnight to a storm and a bank in the same week. The cooperative had been a pact among neighbors when the county and the clouds forgot them. Share water, share tools, share seed. Each member carried a box like this, a kit to rebuild a life after the weather went mad." Mara turned a page and read aloud, softer now, as if reading to a child falling asleep. "If you are opening this, it means drought has taught you its hard language. Inside you'll find heritage seed that laughs at poor soil, instructions to restore the old gate valve by the ridge, and the paper that says the water is ours by law, signed by every hand that mattered back then. If a man with money says otherwise, show him what his father signed." Elias felt the room tilt. He reached for the map. A pencil line traced the old canal like a vein, running from the abandoned windmill above town to a junction beneath the ridge. beneath Harrow's fence line. Next to the junction was a symbol, a small wheel drawn with 8 spokes, and beneath it, valve. A note in the margin said, "Find the Noonstone by the leaning post. Stand where the shadow splits the rock. Dig until the earth tastes of rust. Turn together. Turn together," Mara repeated, as if testing the weight of those 2 words. Ash thumped his tail against the floor. The sound startled them. Elias opened the packet of paper envelopes. Each was labeled sorghum, drought, tepary bean, amaranth, black maize, semi-arid. At the bottom of the box lay a cloth pouch. Inside was the brass token and a folded page covered in signatures that looked like tree roots. Men and women who had once written their names like prayers. At the top, water sharing compact. Lower down, in the same stern hand as the journal, a line underlined twice. No single landholder may restrict or divert flow from the junction except by vote of the cooperative. Mara ran a fingertip over a name near the bottom. Ruth Ellison, she whispered. That's Widow Ruth's maiden name. Another line. Harrow, William. The family name sat there like a stone in a boot. The kitchen felt crowded now, not with bodies but with the past. Elias shut the lid and the hum returned, faint like wind passing over a bottle mouth. He opened it again. The hum softened. He closed it once more, and the sound pressed at the edges of the room. Mara cocked her head. "It's the chimney," she said after a moment. "Air slipping through the seam when you close it. The box is singing, or reminding us to move," Elias said. He looked toward the window. Outside, night had deepened enough that the yard disappeared and the stars came close. "Tomorrow at noon, we find that stone. It will bring trouble," Mara said. "It will bring water," he answered, and the 2 sentences stood facing each other for a long heartbeat. Then she nodded, as if bowing to the truth both carried. They slept poorly. Each time Elias closed his eyes, he saw the brass token glinting like a coin tossed to decide a man's fate. Around dawn, he dozed and dreamed that the field rose and fell like the chest of a sleeping animal. When the rooster finally remembered his duty, Elias woke with a sentence already formed in his mouth. "Turn together." He said it aloud, and Ash came to the bed, tail sweeping the floor, as if agreeing. By mid-morning, word had traveled along the invisible wires that connect people who share the same weather. Widow Ruth brought coffee and intent. The Morales boys arrived with a pry bar and an optimism that had survived 2 failed engines. "My father told me about the cooperative," the elder boy Mateo said. "Said the deal died the day the windmill lost its tail and the county let Harrow build his siphon." "Deals don't die," Ruth said. "People forget them. Paper remembers." At 11:50 they walked to the leaning post. The sun fired straight down into the world like an accusation. The Noonstone they found was not a boulder at all, but a flat, oval rock set into the ground, pale as old ash. When the post's shadow split it in 2, Elias stood where the map instructed. He turned slowly, reading the earth like a sentence with missing words. Then he pointed. There. They scraped. The soil changed from dust to compacted grit, to the gritty damp of iron swaddled in dirt. Mateo's pry bar rang on metal and everyone jerked backward, startled by the possibility of success. Elias cleared a circle and exposed a round cap with 8 spokes, exactly as drawn. The cap's face was stamped with the star and seed. Ruth crossed herself. "It's been waiting." Ash barked once. The sound bounced off the ridge and returned as if the land were repeating the command to itself. "Turn." The wheel refused at first, which made sense. Anything that old and important learned stubbornness to survive. Elias put both hands on it. Mateo added his. His younger brother, Luis, wedged the pry bar between 2 spokes and leaned with all the skinny strength the season had left him. Ruth braced her feet in the dirt and hauled as if dragging a drowning friend to shore. The wheel groaned. Long, low, the voice of a metal throat that hadn't spoken in decades, and then slipped back that heartbreaking fraction that means hope and failure at the same time. "Again," Elias said. They tried again and the wheel moved another sliver. Rust dust drifted up like the ghosts of rain. Something deep beneath them clanked in response. A horn blared. They all turned. Mr. Harrow's truck rolled up in a glitter of expensive chrome, throwing sunlight around like a careless rich man throws change. Harrow stepped out in a white shirt too clean for a farm and a hat that didn't know sweat. 2 of his men climbed down behind him, broad and bored. "What are we doing?" Harrow asked, like a schoolmaster catching children with a book they weren't assigned. His smile folded onto his face the way you shut a lid you plan to open later. Restoring a community valve, Ruth said before anyone else could swallow their tongue. Protected by law. Law? Harrow's laugh was well practiced, pleasant without being sincere. There's no law here older than my water rights. Mara held up the folded compact. She had come quietly after finishing the morning's bread, apron still powdered with flour like a snowfall no one expected. Your father's name is on this, she said, along with half the county. It says no one landholder can restrict flow. Harrow glanced at the paper and did not move closer. Even if that were real, he said softly, it would be too old to matter. And even if it mattered, the canal upstream is dry. The windmill hasn't pulled water since your grandparents were young enough to pretend. Then you won't mind if we turn the wheel, Elias said. Harrow studied Elias's face as if memorizing the exact shape of a future problem. Men who go digging under my fence often find themselves confused about where their property ends. I hate confusion. It leads to accidents. Ruth stepped forward until her shoes threw their small shadows onto Harrow's polished boots. Record this accident, she said, tapping the compact with two sharp fingers, as the Day of Valley remembered how to share. Harrow's smile failed to climb his face this time. I'll be back with a deputy and a folded flag of some kind, he said as if he were choosing from a menu. Go home. Let the drought teach you manners. He climbed back into his truck and dust rose behind him like angry applause. Silence returned. It wasn't empty. It was filled with choice. We don't have time to argue with uniforms, Mara said. Turn together. They turned. The wheel moved in lurches now, language coming back to a mouth unused to speaking. With each fraction, the iron cap grew warmer, as if friction were waking it from inside. The spokes creaked. The old bolt beneath them groaned through its life story. Mateo wiped his brow and laughed once, the kind of laugh a man makes when the cliff he's climbing finally admits it's a hill. Stop, Elias said suddenly. They froze. He bent, pressed his ear to the metal, and closed his eyes. Beneath the scrape and grind he heard a different sound. A slow slosh, then a hush like a careful foot stepping into a shallow pool. He swallowed, afraid to scare the sound away. There's water down there, he whispered, not daring to turn the whisper into a claim. Luis dropped to his stomach and pressed his ear to the iron in turn. His eyes went wide and wet. I hear it, he said, the words a small prayer. They turned again until the wheel refused to yield another breath. Then they waited. Waiting is hard when a life is balanced on it. It got harder when Harrow's truck returned. Deputy in tow, a man whose badge rested on a belly built by other people's bad years. Afternoon, the deputy said. I hear there's trouble. No trouble, Ruth said. Just neighbors turning what their grandparents built. The deputy eyed the compact in Mara's hands, decided reading was a chore, and nodded toward Harrow. Mr. Harrow says this is his dirt. It's everyone's water, Elias said, and realized the absurd bravery of hearing himself speak like a man who believed the sentence would stand even if he didn't. Harrow pointed at the wheel. Close it. We can't, Mateo said through gritted teeth. It took 4 of us to move it an inch. It's not going anywhere. The deputy scratched his jaw. Well, if no harm's done, perhaps we... A sound interrupted him. A hollow knock ran under their feet. Then a distant rush, subtle but sure, as if someone had pulled back a curtain underground. The deputy's voice trailed off. Everyone turned toward the ditch that traced the base of the ridge like a line someone had drawn, and then tried to erase. A damp darkness spread along the ditch floor. First a stain, then a trickle. At a bend 30 yards away, a thin sheet of water skipped over a stone and caught the light. It was not much. It was everything. The deputy's mouth opened, closed. He took off his hat, scratched his head, and said the sentence all officials learn to say when the world makes a choice without them. I'll need to check the books. Check the names, Ruth said, holding out the compact. They'll remind you who we were. The men left in more dust. The sound of the small flow grew. It licked its way along the ditch toward the low plots like a shy animal rediscovering a path to a remembered home. That evening, the Morales boys followed the trickle, clearing old blockages with shovels and the stubborn joy of salvage. Children ran along the ditch banks shouting, "Water! Water!" as if they had invented it. Mara filled a pail and dabbed her wrists, face, the hollow at her throat. She passed a dipper to Elias. He drank and tasted iron, stone, and something sweeter. Relief, maybe, or gratitude ground into molecules. Ash trotted ahead, barking at nothing and at miracles. The next day, Harrow's men cut the fence where it crossed the ditch, and the deputy arrived again with papers that wanted to be important. But the compact had another gift. In the journal, Ansel Ward had copied the county's stamp and the recorder's number. Ruth found the ledger at the courthouse buried under newer books that had not yet proven their worth. The clerk, catching a whiff of a story that might someday matter, stamped a fresh copy. "Strange," she said, tapping the line with Harrow's family name. "The signature matches the water deed downstream." Harrow's smile shrank day by day, like a shirt after a hot wash. He tried polite. Then he tried loud. Finally, he tried to buy the cedar box outright. Elias listened, thanked him for the compliment of the offer, and said no. Men with little learn how to decline softly. It bruises fewer friendships and fewer egos. But this was not about manners. This was about memory deciding it would not be dismissed. A week later, when the trickle had become a thread and the thread the promise of a ribbon, the church bell rang once at an odd hour. It was Ruth, leaning on the rope with both hands, telling anyone within earshot of the valley's shape that it was time to bring wrenches, oil, and courage to the old windmill above town. If the valve had remembered how to open, perhaps the windmill could remember how to lift. Elias looked at Mara. She handed him the brass token. "Carry this," she said. "If any part of this is a miracle, it's the kind that happens when many hands turn the same wheel." "Turn together," he echoed, and the words felt less like a plan now, and more like a creed. The windmill stood on the hill like a skeleton that had promised to dance again and then changed its mind. Its tail was split, and the vanes hung at odd angles, feathers plucked by years. Beneath it, a pump house sagged, roof patched with tin and hope. The well cap was bolted shut with rust that had learned every lesson time could teach. People came. It began with the families who still had crops stubborn enough to pretend. Then those who had left returned for the day, pulled by the gossip of possibility. Men with sleeves rolled, women with tools, children with the best resource of all, noise that sounded like the future refusing to whisper. Even a few of Harrow's field hands came after sundown, faces shadowed with the guilt of wage against conscience. They carried their own tools wrapped in shirts, as if smuggling honesty past a sleeping guard. Mateo clambered up the windmill's ladder with a rope in his teeth the way a boy learns to be a man when the county isn't looking. He tied a new tail, cobbled from sheet metal, and the sign that had once pointed drivers toward a motel that could no longer afford neon. Luis and Elias oiled the crank. Ruth mixed sand and grease the way bakers learn to improvise when recipes fail. Mara brought sandwiches no one had time to eat, which is the degree of success people forget to celebrate. They worked until dusk admitted it was night. The first push of the tail caught a reluctant breeze, and the vanes turned a quarter circle, then stuttered. A groan rose from the pump house, familiar now, the sound of old iron remembering its vowels. Someone cheered prematurely, and the vanes stopped again, offended. "Again," Elias said, and the word had become the valley's heartbeat. They cranked by hand to give the gears an idea of how to behave. They tightened a tendon here, loosened a muscle there. Bit by bit the vanes began to circle, not gracefully, no, not yet, but with that stubborn grace that precedes elegance. Wind arrived as if embarrassed to be late. The tail swung. The vanes spun. Then everyone held their breath for a different sound, the ancient cough of a pump that has decided to forgive. It came, first a choking rattle, then a deep glug that set the floorboards under their feet trembling, as if someone large were climbing the stairs below. Water rose inside the pipe, slow as a story told by an old man who knows he will not be interrupted. The first splash into the trough was brown, thick with the past. The second was clearer. The third shone with a sky caught inside it. A cheer tore out of them like fabric ripping to make way for something useful. Children ran with buckets. Women laughed the laugh that repaints walls without a brush. Men hugged in that awkward way men do when they have hidden too long from the comfort of being seen. Even Ash, who rarely wasted breath on frivolity, barked himself hoarse. Elias dipped his hands and lifted water into the light. It fell through his fingers in ropes of silver. He thought of his father and the small iron key. He thought of Ansel Ward's careful script. He thought of Mara's quiet courage set against days that trampled fences. He pressed the brass token into Ruth's palm. "You start," he said. "Your name is on the paper next to the stars." Ruth smiled in a way that made her look 10 years younger and 20 years truer. She handed the token to a child who passed it to another, who passed it again. The token traveled the circle like a word that learns to be a language. By the time it returned to Elias, the trough was full and the ditch below the hill was singing louder. Harrow arrived then, predictably, at the height of joy, because that is when men who need to be important prefer to show up. He wore the face he used at ribbon cuttings. The deputy trailed behind, eyes complicated. "This is illegal," Harrow said, too loud for the wind's taste. "You can't just—" Ruth held up the stamped ledger copy. The deputy took it and read this time. Perhaps because water makes even officials thirsty for truth. He traced the recorder's number with his finger, then exhaled. "Mr. Harrow," he said, voice careful, "you've got shares. Larger than most. But not all the shares. The compact stands." Harrow took a step closer to Elias, as if proximity could purchase consent. "You think a trickle will save you? Weather doesn't change because you found an old wheel." "No," Elias said, meeting the man's eyes not as a challenger but as someone who had stopped being invited to surrender. "Weather doesn't. People do." A tremor ran through the windmill's bones, not from fear, but from wind gathering itself. The vanes spun hard, the pump leapt in its housing, and water surged. It spilled over the trough and leapt the lip like a thing glad to remember motion. The ditch below widened at its edges, greedy for reunion. Down in the low plots, someone shouted that the flow had reached the split rock. The news traveled like song. Mara opened the journal to the envelopes of seed. She held up one labeled Tipari bean and laughed. "Food that doesn't mind a bad year," she said. "Seems polite to offer it a better one." People lined along the first furrow and dropped seeds in the moist soil as if setting candles in a cathedral. Children patted earth with reverent palms. The moon rose pale and embarrassed to have missed the beginning. Coyotes on the far ridge sang either worry or approval. It is hard to tell with coyotes. Ash lay at Elias's feet and thumped his tail. Dog language for good work. "More, please." Harrow left without slamming his door. It was a small courtesy, but even small courtesies are data. By morning, he would send a lawyer. By afternoon, someone would call from the county seat with phrases like interpretation and injunction. Paper would meet paper. But tonight, water met earth, and the earth remembered. Elias walked the ditch home with Mara and Ash as if escorting a friend. The sound alongside them was not yet a rush. It was a steady whisper, like a storyteller clearing his throat before a long tale. They slept with the windows open. Sometime near dawn, a breeze wandered in carrying a smell neither had known in years. Damp dust about to become mud, the breath of seeds writing their first sentences underground. When Elias finally dreamed, he was a boy again, and the table above him was full of men arguing. But this time they argued about how to share, not how to take. And when he woke, he felt taller. The weeks that followed did not turn the valley into a postcard. Hard things did not dissolve simply because water had returned to the grammar of the place. There were disputes over schedules and shares, fences to mend and ditches to clear, letters to answer and deputies to placate. Harrow's lawyer arrived with a briefcase heavy enough to anchor a boat. The cooperative compact, however, weighed more. It had the density of memory, signatures layered like sediment. The county recorder stamped the copy again as if to underline history with fresh ink. The flow from the windmill and the reopened valve did not make anyone rich. It did something better. It made mornings feel like promises instead of wagers. Children learned the sound of water on stone the way they once learned silence. Gardens returned first in patches, greens along kitchen doors and beans climbing twine like nervous acrobats. Then the fields took the hint. Tipari beans survived where pride might have failed. Sorghum stood up when wheat would have knelt. Amaranth flashed red in a way that felt like a hymn. Elias's hands changed. They did not soften. Work never promised that. But they learned a new vocabulary of repair instead of rescue. At night, he and Mara read Ansel Ward's journal the way people read the weather, to understand patterns, not to worship predictions. They found entries where Ansel described drought years and the rule that saved them most. When a man starts counting only his portion, send him to the ditch with a shovel and a child. Either the ditch will teach him, or the child will. Widow Ruth took charge of the ledger. She wrote names with a pen that scratched like a cricket, and told anyone who asked that the book was not a weapon. It was a reminder. The Morales boys fixed the pump's cough, then engineered something like a throttle, using a bicycle chain and the stubborn belief that nothing is ever exactly impossible. Even the deputy helped, a little, by forgetting to deliver papers until after meetings where decisions had already been made. One evening, when the first rows of Tipari beans sprouted a fuzz of green that made the world look newly shaved, Harrow came alone. He stood at the fence and watched Elias pull a weed and tuck it into his pocket. as if weeds were guilty only the first time. "I found my father's copy," Harrow said without introduction. "He signed that compact the week his brother died. The story in our house always said the cooperative cost us money we couldn't spare." "And what does the paper say?" Elias asked. Harrow looked toward the windmill, turning its slow prayer. "It says we kept the valley alive long enough for my family to afford a story." He sucked in a long breath, then let it out, as if exhaling a season. "I'll set my irrigators to release at night when your draw is highest," he said. "Tell Ruth to write it in pencil first." He managed a half-smile. "We'll see if my mouth keeps up with my hand." When he left, Elias stroked Ash's ears. "Sometimes men change like weather after all," he said. Ash panted, which is dog for sometimes. On the day the beans flowered and the sorghum heads flushed gold, Mara planted a few of the black maize seeds in a circle and set the brass token on a string above them, a small sun watching over a smaller universe. She told the story to the children, how a dog led a man to a field that hummed, how a box sang when it closed, how a map taught grown-ups to look at noon, how turned together can lift a wheel and a town. "And the humming?" one child asked, eyes wide with that hunger good stories feed. Mara smiled. "The wind found a seam and turned it into a song," she said. "Or maybe the land had something to say and borrowed the wind's voice. Either way, we listened." At sunset, Elias walked to the leaning fence post and laid his palm on the noonstone, now rimmed with thin grass that didn't dare the place before. He thought of his father's key and Ansel's journal, of Ruth's ledger and the boys' unpretty perfect repairs, of Mara's hands that could knead flour into bread and fear into patience. He thought of Ash, who had led without speaking because trust doesn't always wear words. Some miracles arrive as thunder, others arrive as instructions. This one had arrived as both, a hum and a map, an old wheel and the sentence that made it move. He looked at his field, still scarred, still stubborn, and felt no shame in loving it, not for what it promised to give, but for what it had taught him to become. The valley would see dry years again. No paper could outlaw weather, but now it had a habit stronger than drought, gathering, reading the old names, turning the wheel together. Gratitude took on practical shapes, ditches maintained before they demanded attention, seeds saved for neighbors, schedules kept even when no one was counting. Justice, it turned out, was not a gavel, but a ledger and a rope on a windmill and a hand on a spoke beside another hand. Elias bent down to water his crops. For a second, in the reflection in the shallow furrow, he saw not his own face, but a collage, his father's jaw, Ansel's neat script, Ruth's quick smile, the boy's grease-blackened fingers, Mara's steady gaze, Ash's eyes shining like two coins spent wisely. He blinked, and it was only his face again, lined, tired, alight. He whispered the words that had built a season and might yet build a life, turned together. The wind lifted. Somewhere in the distance the pump answered, and the field replied with the softest sound a place can make, the hush of something growing where it had once only been dry.